Hey folks, Mr. Howard here, coming at you with Chapter 10 from the picture of Dorian Gray. Last time we read Chapter 9. Chapter 9 is a really important chapter. Basil comes to visit Dorian to try and console him for the suicide of Sybil Vane, which happened the previous day. He finds Dorian already consoled and is sort of upset. He doesn't know what happened to the good character of Dorian. But we all know what happened to the good character of Dorian. Lord Henry visited him the previous day and convinced him that the goal of life is to become the spectator of one's own life. To view one's own life as art is to escape the pain of life. And Dorian has essentially espoused this philosophy. Basil is too late to have any effect on him. The chapter's full of a lot of irony. Basil essentially confesses his love to Dorian. And Dorian was hoping to find out why the picture changes. This confession is disappointing to him, and he tells Basil that, and it sort of crushes Basil, so much so that Basil leaves without ever getting Dorian's confession about the picture out of him. And so there's a lot of dramatic irony and that kind of thing. But at the end of the chapter, Dorian makes the fatal decision to essentially be evil. He says that he's going to be like the Greek gods. He's going to be eternally young, and the picture is to bear the burden of his shame, and nobody will ever see it. It will change with age, with sin, with all the moods that he gives way to, and that essentially he severed his outer appearance from his inner soul. There's sort of an inversion of that going on, which is clearly important to the theme. So we're going to move into Chapter 10 today, and Chapter 10 is sort of the last chapter of Dorian Gray's youth. The book is in two parts. Chapters 1 through 10 are the story of Dorian Gray's youth, and chapter 11 is sort of this montage of many years passing, and then after that, chapters 12 to 20 are going to be the story of Dorian Gray when he's older. And so we're at a particular turning point here that you want to pay attention to, and I think it's time to talk about something in the story that I haven't really talked about yet, that I think thematically is important. I think that Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray is a book that is a little bit in conversation with Frankenstein. So if you've read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, the story of Frankenstein is a story about a monster. The monster doesn't have a name. It's not named Frankenstein. Frankenstein is the name of the scientist who creates the monster and the protagonist of the book. But the monster is intelligent and actually good-natured, but the fact that the monster is always perceived as evil turns him evil. He's told that he's a monster by everybody with whom he comes in contact, and so he becomes a monster as a result. It's similar to Othello. It's similar to a lot of other stories that go on, but in this story, we've got the opposite going on, but it doesn't have the opposite result. What happens if you always project goodness, if people always say that you're kind and good because of the way you look on the outside? How does that affect your inside? If you're free from any kind of condemnation or responsibility for the actions that you've taken, how does that affect one's behavior? And the interesting thing, I don't want to give away the book. I'm not going to spoil it for you. The interesting thing to think about is, it has to do. It's an inversion of the Frankenstein story, but the outcome is not entirely different, and we want to pay attention to that. And I think Oscar Wilde is saying something here about Victorian England and its own self-perception. It sees itself as a force for good in the world, but when you look at the history of Victorian England and all the things that it did with the mercantile system, with subjugating native cultures and destroying them, with its impact on the world, there's a lot of negative stuff, but the Victorians didn't see any of that. They only saw the external good that the British Empire was doing, and there was plenty of good. I'm not going to tell you it's not. The British Empire is a really complicated topic, and anybody who studies history, go study it and try and decide whether the overall impact of the British Empire was positive or negative. That's something that we can debate a lot, but I think if the character Dorian Gray represents on some level Victorian England, then the fact that his outward appearance is stable and perfect, but his inner soul is very different, is symbolic, and we want to talk about that symbolism in chapter 10 and certainly in chapter 11, which is coming up, and we've sort of engaged that. So it's just another level, another sort of nuance that you can pay attention to as we read the chapters and continue on in the story. I've talked for 5 minutes. Let's open up chapter 10 and get reading. Chapter 10. When his servant entered, this is Dorian, he looked at him steadfastly and wondered if he had thought of peering behind the screen. The man was quite impassive and waited for his orders. Dorian lit a cigarette and walked over to the glass and glanced into it. He could see the reflection of Victor's face perfectly. It was like a placid mask of servility. There was nothing to be afraid of there, yet he thought it best to be on his guard. Speaking very slowly, he told him to tell the housekeeper that he wanted to see her, and then go to the frame maker and ask him to send 2 of his men round at once. It seemed to him that as the man left the room, his eyes wandered in the direction of the screen. Or was that merely his own fancy? So Dorian's getting a little paranoid. You're going to see this whole chapter is sort of about his paranoia that somebody's going to see the picture. Somebody's going to glimpse his soul. He's perversely hiding his soul and relying only on his external appearance. After a few moments, in her black silk dress with old-fashioned thread mittens on her wrinkled hands, Mrs. Leaf bustled into the library. He asked her for the key of the schoolroom. "The old schoolroom, Mr. Dorian?" she exclaimed. "Why, it's full of dust. I must get it arranged and put straight before you go into it. It is not fit for you to see. It is not indeed." "I don't want it put straight, Leaf. I only want the key." "Well, sir, you'll be covered with cobwebs if you go into it. Why, it hasn't been opened for nearly 5 years, not since his lordship died." He winced at the mention of his grandfather. He had hateful memories of him. "That does not matter," he answered. "I simply want to see the place, that is all. Give me the key." "And here it is, sir," said the old lady, going over the contents of her bunch with tremulously uncertain hands. "Here is the key. I'll have it off the bunch in a moment. But you don't think of living up there, sir? And you so comfortable here." "No, no," he cried petulantly. "Thank you, Leaf. That will do." She lingered for a few moments and was garrulous over some detail of the household. He sighed and told her to manage things as she thought best. She left the room wreathed in smiles. As the door closed, Dorian put the key in his pocket and looked round the room. His eye fell on a large purple satin coverlet, heavily embroidered with gold, and a splendid piece of late 17th century Venetian work that his grandfather had found in a convent near Bologna. Yes, that would serve to wrap the dreadful thing in. It had perhaps served often as a pall for the dead. Now it was to hide something that had corruption of its own, worse than the corruption of death itself, something that would breed horrors and yet would never die. What the worm was to the corpse, his sins would be to the painted image on the canvas. They would mar its beauty and eat away its grace. They would defile it and make it shameful. And yet the thing would still live on. It would always be alive. Plus, it's interesting for a soul to always be alive. I mean, that's pretty straightforward diction. But he's got this beautiful artistic purple cloth that he's going to use to cover his picture. This used to belong in a convent where it probably covered dead bodies that got corrupted. And you get these great lines. What the worm was to the corpse, his sins would be to the painted image on the canvas. So his sins will decay his soul over time. They're going to mar its beauty and eat away its grace. That word grace, I think, is important. Like, we can get down on the level of the sentence and we can analyze what's going on here. His sins are going to eat away the grace of his soul's form, which used to be perfection. Remember that the picture in its original form was a union of soul and body. It was the perfection that he was. He was that perfect image, which he now physically portrays. That was his internal image, and that's going to change. He shuddered, and for a moment he regretted that he had not told Basil the true reason why he wished to hide the picture away. Basil would have helped him resist Lord Henry's influence, and the still more poisonous influences that came from his own temperament. The love that he bore him, for it really was love, had nothing in it that was not noble and intellectual. So Basil has deep love for Dorian, and he would have helped him overcome this. It was not that the mere physical admiration of beauty that is born of the senses, and that dies when the senses tire. It was such a love as Michelangelo had known, and Montaigne, and Winckelmann, and Shakespeare himself. It's a lot of illusions. Basil could have saved him, but it was too late now. The past could always be annihilated. Regret, denial, or forgetfulness could do that. But the future was inevitable. There were passions in him that would find their terrible outlet, dreams that would make the shadow of their evil real. He took up from the couch the great purple and gold texture that covered it, and holding it in his hands, passed behind the screen. Was the face on the canvas viler than before? It seemed to him that it was unchanged, and yet his loathing of it was intensified. gold hair, blue eyes, and rose-red lips. They were all there. It was simply the expression that had altered. That was horrible in its cruelty. Compared to what he saw in it of censure or rebuke, how shallow Basil's reproaches about Sybil Vane had been. How shallow, and of what little account. His own soul was looking out at him from the canvas and calling him to judgment. A look of pain came across him, and he flung the rich pall over the picture. As he did so, a knock came at the door. He passed out as his servant entered. So the picture is calling him to judgment, and he throws this pall of death over it so he doesn't have to look at it. So now not only is he hiding the picture from the rest of the world, he's hiding the picture from himself because he feels like it's his conscience. The persons are here, monsieur. He felt that the man must be got rid of at once. He must not be allowed to know where the picture was being taken to. There was something sly about him, and he had thoughtful, treacherous eyes. Sitting down at the writing table, he scribbled a note to Lord Henry, asking him to send him round something to read, and reminding him that they were to meet at 8:15 that evening. "Wait for an answer," he said, handing it to him, "and show the men in here." In 2 or 3 minutes, there was another knock, and Mr. Hubbard himself, the celebrated frame maker of South Audley Street, came in with a somewhat rough-hewn young assistant. Mr. Hubbard was a florid, red-whiskered little man whose admiration for art was considerably tempered by the inveterate impecuniosity of most of the artists who dealt with him. As a rule, he never left his shop. He waited for people to come to him. But he always made an exception in favor of Dorian Gray. There was something about Dorian that charmed everybody. It was a pleasure even to see him. "What can I do for you, Mr. Gray?" he said, rubbing his fat, freckled hands. "I thought I would do myself the honor of coming round in person. I have just got a beauty of a frame, sir. Picked it up on sale. Old Florentine. Came from Fonthill, I believe. Admirably suited for a religious subject, Mr. Gray." "I am so sorry you have given yourself the trouble of coming round, Mr. Hubbard. I shall certainly drop in and look at the frame, though I don't go in much at present for religious art." Ah, right, like the picture is religious art. It's a picture of his soul. That's... All right, sorry. I just love it when Oscar Wilde does little ironic puns like that. Maybe it's sort of a dad joke. I don't know. "Though I don't go in much at present for religious art. But today I only want a picture carried up to the top of the house for me. It is rather heavy, so I thought I would ask you to lend me a couple of your men." "No trouble at all, Mr. Gray. I'm delighted to be of any assistance to you. Which is a work of art, sir?" "This," replied Dorian, moving the screen back. "Can you move it, covering and all, just as it is? I don't want it to get scratched going upstairs." "There will be no difficulty, sir," said the genial frame maker, beginning with the aid of his assistant to unhook the picture from the long brass chains by which it was suspended. "And now where shall we carry it to, Mr. Gray?" "I will show you the way, Mr. Hubbard. If you will kindly follow me, or perhaps you had better go in front. I am afraid it is right at the top of the house. We will have to go up by the front stairway, as it is wider." Pause. I think we're getting little hints of the paranoia. I mean, obviously he's paranoid of Victor. He wants him to move the picture with a covering over it, and he wants him to go up first so he can look at them and make sure that they don't look at the picture on the way up to the top of the house. He held the door open for them, and they passed out in the hall and began the ascent. The elaborate character of the frame had made the picture extremely bulky, and now and then, in spite of the obsequious protests of Mr. Hubbard, who had a true tradesman's spirited dislike of seeing a gentleman doing anything useful, Dorian put his hand to it so as to help him. "Something of a load to carry, sir," gasped the little man when they reached the top landing, and wiped his shiny forehead. "I'm afraid it is rather heavy," murmured Dorian, as he unlocked the door and opened into a room that was to keep for him the curious secret of his life and hide his soul from the eyes of men. He had not entered the place for more than 4 years, not indeed since he had used it first as a playroom when he was a child, and then as a study when he grew somewhat older. I'm going to pause there for a second. This room, I think, is symbolic. It's important. This place that is going to keep the corruption of Dorian's soul is the place that he spent his childhood in. It's a place of innocence for him. Maybe a sort of Garden of Eden place of his. He hasn't been in it since he was innocent. He hasn't entered this room since he changed and was influenced. So I think all of this is important and probably symbolic.